Ladies and gentlemen, today I welcome you back to this presentation. Also to speak, we talk about the Communist Manifesto. Now, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto is simultaneously inaugurated political as well as intellectual movements. It is essentially a pamphlet that outlines the platforms of the Communist Party. So, amongst us here is a Communist Manifesto, which is a brief publication which I'll take you through. Now, by and large, ladies and gentlemen, we talk about, in this particular instance, categorically, the 4 chapters that outlined or summarizes the Communist Manifesto. The first one being the bourgeois versus the proletarians. The second will deal on proletarians versus the communists. And the third will conceptualize the socialist as well as the communist literature. Now lastly, the fourth will compound something to do with the position of the communists in relation to various position parties. I will then take you through some of the main points of the Communist Manifesto, talking about of all the histories is the history of the class struggle. Very interesting. Tune in with me as we take through the first part. So the first part, which I just said, is about introduction to something to do with the Karl Marx Communist Manifesto. The Karl Marx Communist Manifesto simultaneously inaugurated political as well as the intellectual movements. It is essentially a pamphlet that outlines or characterizes the ideologies of the Communist Party. We must be able to conceptualize the fact that Karl Marx and this other fellow who is known as the Friedrich Engels pioneered this kind of manifesto of the communist people. That is way back something to do with the 1880s or 18th century. Now then, it's essentially a pamphlet that outlines the platform of the Communist Party. So Marx or Karl Marx authored it with this fellow, with Friedrich Engels, in 1848, after the Communist Party or the Communist League had commissioned them to write it. So their Communist Manifesto had an undeniable impact on both the world events, including the Communist Revolution in Russia, and on the research such as fields to do with the sociology. Now then, Karl Marx was born in 1818 and he died on 1883. During his life, he witnessed the Industrial Revolution and its major impacts on the working class. While developing his thoughts at a time of political instability, especially in France, Marx sought to understand the crisis of his age, drawing from the training in philosophy, which had notably involved studying George Wilhelm or Friedrich Engels and Ludwig Feuerbach. Now, that is about the introduction bit of it. We now move on to the Communist Manifesto, which is a brief publication, guys, and declares the arguments as well as the platform on which the Communist Party is deeply rooted. Now then, it was written in 1847 by Karl Marx, who is a theorist in this particular case, and his other fellow is Friedrich Engels, and was commissioned by the Communist League as a political party based in England. Two sides of the same coin. We dealt with that in the beginning there was the capitalist or capitalism, which was being breached by the West. Now the other opposing side of which you turn the coin on the other end is that of the communism. Now communism was being preached by two individuals, which this particular instance I've talked about Karl Marx and this other fellow is Friedrich Engels. Now we now characterize or associate ourselves with the summary of this manifesto. Now, as already talked about, that this pamphlet, Marx decided to gradually divide it into 4 particular chapters, which will conceptualize the bourgeois versus the proletarians versus the communists, and that of the socialists versus the communist literature, and lastly, we'll talk about the position of the communists in relation to the opposition parties. First things first, guys, we begin with the bourgeois and the proletarians. Now, this particular chapter is more interesting since it is the first chapter that establishes the basic problem of the communist, which is said to be addressed by this communist. More specifically, it explains how a society is increasingly organized around two classes, the bourgeois and the proletarians. So then we talk about the bourgeois and then the proletarians. So, a society is structured in such a way that it moves or it brings us to the issues to the conflict between the two classes. Whereas in the bourgeois exploits and dominates the proletariat. Now the bourgeois in this particular instance is the government. Probably that is what Marx did argue, that the bourgeois will represent an entity like a government who would be able to exploit or dominate the proletariats. So the bourgeois is the class defined by owning the means of production, for example, money, machines, land, and factories. Whereas the proletariat is the class that is defined by the selling their labor for wages. So this is the working class. Two sides which will now bring us to conflict of interest. In a capitalist society, guys, the bourgeois purchases the labor of workers through wages, and because they own the means of production and the labor they have bought, they own the products that are made. Even though the proletariat made the product, they do not own whatever they produced, and all of these profits are enjoyed by the bourgeois. Capitalism requires that the bourgeois constantly innovate the production process, such as inventing the assembly line, implementing middle managers to maintain productivity. These innovations allows the bourgeois to sell their products at lower prices and compete in an open market. Guys, to sum up, we say that Marx contended that this underlying logic would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism, since it transformed the masses of the society into proletariats, while simultaneously trying to diminish that class, for instance, by paying them low wages and replacing with the machines. So, guys, in this particular instance, talking about the bourgeois and proletarians for the first particular chapter, is that the communists try to address the basic problem which it faces. And secondly, we now move on to the second chapter in this particular communist manifesto. Very interesting, guys. Now this is about the proletarians versus the communists. So it can be said that the first chapter was sought to address the problem of the capitalism. The second chapter offers solutions. More specifically, Marx outlines the Communist Party its goals, how the Communist Party is the party of the working class. So here, whereas the first one, which was about the proletarians versus the bourgeois, was dealing out with the problems of the communist. This one is sought to, this second chapter is about the proletarians versus the communists, is sought to bring about the solutions. Let's see. So in chapter 2, which I've just talked about, is that Marx advocated for dictatorship of the proletariat, which is supposed to be a temporary arrangement in which workers seize the means of production and the government. In addition to the seizure of the means of production and government, Marx advocates here for abolishing of the right to inherit, abolishing the distinctions between the country and the town, centralizing credit and establishing a state bank, as well as abolishing the privately owned land. Marx also notes that the communists will not act against the existing worker parties. So we talked about this one, now gives us the solutions to the first problem which we talked about in this particular instance, guys. And by and large, Marx gives us the solutions here that we will be able to abolish the right to inherit, abolishing the distinctions between town and country, and the establishment of a state bank, as well as abolishing privately owned. So we talk about communism, communal ownership, in short. Now the third chapter is that which unveils the socialist and the communist literature. The socialist and the communist literature. Now this is the third chapter, focuses on distinguishing communism from other closely related ideologies, or at least Marx variant. Now Karl Marx really loved this chapter because of his version of communism is distinct from the utopian what? Socialism. So for instance, because utopian socialism does not attempt to show how the problems of capitalism necessarily lead to the version of communism. Marx also rejected a reactionary and the bourgeois socialism. So he discredited the utopian what? Socialism. But by and large, he talks about that the problems of capitalism necessarily lead to the version of communism. So in summation, guys, no version of socialism at that point sought to end class conflict and domination. It perpetuated in some of the form or fashion. Communism, however, was going to create a classless society in which there was no class conflict. Thus, communism was more radical than any other socialist literature. That was about the socialist and the communist literature. Now, latterly, we talk about the position of the communists in relation to various opposition parties. We talk about the position of the communists in relation to various opposition parties. Very interestingly, this is the last chapter, or the final chapter, under which focuses on the communists related to politics. So communism and politics go hand in hand here. So the chapter included an overview of the conditions of several countries and regions, as well as appraisal of the functioning organization of workers. Here Marx denotes that Germany was on the eve of bourgeois revolution. Soon, however, workers of the third world of the world would be able to unite for a radical change of the mode of production and exchange. We understand very well that Karl Marx was throughout the reign of, and he witnessed the Industrial Revolution. So as a grandchild of Industrial Revolution, he needed to come up with ways in which would prevent the workers to be exploited. So guys, categorically under those particular columns that are addressed, those ones are all those which compounds the Communist Manifesto. Now, the main points of the Communist Manifesto, very interesting. So guys, below are major points of the Communist Manifesto, sometimes connected with the works of Karl Marx, and I'll focus them, in which I'll talk about, of all histories is the history of class struggle. Of all histories is the history of class struggle. You understand? So guys, here Karl Marx set out the foundational point that are all significance, epochs, and changes consist in material relations. We talk about material relations in this particular instance. So material relations are whatever relationships of production and exchange that arise in human life. Marx has a theory of history that differs from thinking of history in terms of the reactions of several great men, such as the kings and the inventors. History is primarily not by the actions of the individual, but rather the general structure of the society. For instance, an earlier epoch was feudalism, in which a lord-peasant relationship was primary. Consequently, this epoch was defined by the domination of the peasant by a lord. This epoch only ended as the means of production changed, and the merchant class, the bourgeois, could befriend with the other classes and to overthrow the nobility. Those people were rich. However, the bourgeois only replaced the aristocracy, and they did not bring an end to oppression. Marx thought that the communist revolution would be unique, as it will be able to end the class struggle, the history of the class struggle, guys, which is to say end history, or whatever he sometimes called prehistory. Last chapter is categorical. We talk about the summary. What have we talked about in this particular instance, guys? Now, in summary, the Communist Manifesto was published way back in 1848 and consists of a preamble and 4 chapters which have been summarized, as I talked about, the bourgeois and the proletarians, guys, which we unveiled that Marx family states the history, all hitherto existing society is the history of the class struggles. The chapter lays the foundation that the bourgeois, the competition, and the private ownership of land, and forever exploiting the oppressing the proletariat, otherwise known as the working class. Marx says that